Chapter 7. Sharpened axes and toothy saws, carried aloft in scruffy paws, marching in to chop and cleave at roots and shoots, vines and leaves. Gibgob stood in the great squidge, with paws on hips and a stern expression upon her face. She was supervising a group of Scruffs who were dousing the last of the plants with the bin juice tonic. Munch plodded into the square. His arms were full, holding a tight ball of struggling Scruffs. "I have the volunteers," he announced to Gibgob, who picked up her axe and rested it on her shoulder.
"Hurry up, you lazy oaf!"
she screeched at him. Munch plonked the Scruffs down into a big pile. They were a very scruffy lot, even for Scruffs. Some had matted, greasy fur, others were bald or threadbare. They were a sorry, ragtag bunch of all ages, shapes, and sizes. Gibgob stretched a menacing smile around her beak. She now had her army, and was ready to march.
"Gather round! Come closer, you slobs!"
she addressed them formally, whilst clapping her paws at the scattered Scruffs, competing for their attention.
"Listen up, you dirty beasts, and listen up good, or else every single snivelling Scruff is going to climb up the hill to the woods above. You will hack and snip and chop the trees, pull up roots and slice the weeds, saw the branches and tear off the leaves, clip the shoots and grind the seeds."
She mushed her fist into her paw as she smiled through clenched, grinding teeth. The group of Scruffs looked at each other worryingly.
"And where will you be?"
asked Tinkan Crud casually, as he sold tools to the crowd. "With me," replied Munch, who pulled Tinkan up off the floor, holding him up by the collar of his long, ragged wool coat.
"Sounds good to me, boss,"
said Tinkan diplomatically. He tipped his hat to Munch and flashed him a wide, toothy grin. Up Bog Lane marched a long line of Scruffs. They were being herded along by Gibgob, who was riding upon Munch's back. She was carefully watching for any Scruffs who tried to run, slip away down a dark alley, or dive into a pile of trash. They were scared of the forest, but were terrified of Gibgob, so they didn't dare run. They bumped and pushed, bundling along and tripping over one another. A misshapen, mangy, and mismatched rabble, carrying tools of all shapes and sizes. They lurched over mud and squelched through muck, climbing and pushing each other up the hill as slowly as possible until they reached the cliff wall. The rock face rose high above the rooftops of the town, a firm barrier between the thriving forest and the Scruff's squalor. They scrambled and squabbled as they bumbled up the steep, winding path that was cut into the rock. Scared Scruffs at the front tried to slow down. The ones behind were being pushed on by Munch, causing the line to broaden on the narrow path. Some were pushed over the edge, onto the roofs below. A lucky few who escaped the march by faking all manner of new and rare injuries inflicted by the soft wool and straw. The wide scrum of Scruffs eventually reached the top of the path, which opened onto a flowering meadow. They scuttled across the blooming great glade, which they chopped and churned up as they passed to reach the edge of the Scruff's wood. They stopped before they entered the woods, bunching together into a huddle, shivering in terror as they imagined what lay waiting inside. Between the branches they thought they saw fangs and claws. Among the tree trunks they imagined glowing eyes and sinister smiles. Shadows seemed to dart and dance by the gaps in the thicket fence, disappearing before any Scruff could get a good look. A twisted gate of branches and roots framed a dark path which led into cold, blue shadow. A gust of wind swept a whirlwind of leaves down the path towards the group. The Scruff bunch turned as one and ran away, until they hit the large, bristly wall of fur that was Munch. He towered over them, the scowling face of Gibgob peeking over his shoulder.
"And where do you think you're going?"
She growled at them through gritted teeth.
"We were just getting a good run-up, that's all,"
said Tin Can, who was mushed in the centre of the group, poking out of the top. Gibgob growled and pointed a long, sharp claw towards the woods. Some of the group began to sob, and others forgot how to walk properly, their stumpy legs paralysed with fear. They crept as slowly as they could towards the darkness of the woods. When they finally reached the doorway, they stopped, darting their heads in all directions, fearing what lay in wait. Scrag was nudged out of the crowd and rolled forward through the opening. The entrance closed behind him as the huddle of Scruffs blocked the doorway. Scrag grasped a bottle of bin-juice tonic, his paw over the cork, ready to pop it. He anxiously whirled in circles, looking up at the trees which loomed menacingly over the path with their tall, curling shadows. Their lurching branches, like outstretched arms, appeared ready to snatch him up. Suddenly, from the undergrowth, he heard a rustle in the leaves, which carpeted the forest floor with a dry and crunchy coating. Scrag reacted quickly, turning towards the sound. Leaning back, he thumbed the cork from the bottle with a loud pop. The juice erupted from the vessel with a great foaming fizz. It splashed the leaves and soaked the ground, spooking the rustling creature hidden within the mulch.
I got him, I did." "That'll teach you to sneak up on Scrag,"
he boasted bombastically, making sure every Scruff heard of his bravery. From the soggy pile of leaves popped a rather angry-looking squirrel. Drenched with juice and smelling like a sewer, it shot off, darting up a tree, stopping momentarily to give Scrag one last angry look. He sprayed the last of the juice towards the squirrel's tree until the bottle ran empty.
"Get on with it, you grotty slackers!"
shouted Gibgob from above, as Munch heaved the plug of Scruffs through the entrance hole. She tried to yell once again, but was interrupted by a loud creak. The Scruffs looked around, searching for the source of the sound. The toxic juice had weakened the sprayed tree, and it started to sway and fall. Munch pushed forward, squashing into the huddle of Scruffs. They narrowly escaped from the falling tree, which then blocked the entrance to the Scruffs wood.
"Oh no! We're trapped! We're stuck here forever!"
cried Tin Can, who started to panic. The Scruffs ran to a fallen tree and tried to climb over it.
"Stop!"
yelled Gibgob. They turned to look at her as they clung from the sides of the fallen trunk.
"You're not going to run away. You're going to stay and chop. We came to lop and saw down every tree until the Scruffs wood is destroyed. Now get down from that log, you cowardly rabble. Pick up your tools and get chopping."
The Sprig sat in the branches of a tall, twisted tree, observing the Scruffs, who were sneaking between the tree trunks and shrubs below. It was most interested in the small but loud creature with white curly hair, which rode atop a much larger, lumbering Scruff, and was shouting at all the others below. Gibgob barked and yapped at the Scruffs, who scrambled away towards many different trees. This confused the Sprig, who pondered the motives of the small, stinking beasts. Suddenly, Gibgob let out an alarmingly loud cry.
"Chop!"
The Scruffs swung their axes and pulled their saws. Some scraped at the trunks with blunt shears, and others just threw stones. The trees creaked and cracked, splitting and splaying as the echoes of chopping rang around the forest. The sprig was so shocked it fell out of the tree, then floated to the floor, as light as a feather. Scrunching up into a ball, it rolled away, up the hill towards the Great Grandrasil Tree. The ancient ash was fast asleep, dreaming of sunshine and rain. Extending its branches and leaves, it touched the sky and heard the world whisper upon the rushing gusts of wind. Thick roots spread and curled, burrowing far and wide into the hill on which the scruffswood grew. It felt the essence of life moving through the ground, and the barren desolation on which the town of Scruffyness sprawled. Tingling vibrations touched the tips of the roots, travelled up the fibres of the trunk, and awoke Grandrasil from its slumber. Its creaking yawn rumbled the ground and shook the fallen leaves, which danced across the cracked, dry mud. The sprig tumbled up the hill and came to a stop before the old great tree, then shook its leaves and danced around erratically, imitating and miming what it saw in the wood below. However, Grandrasil had already felt the pitter and patter of the scruff's clawed paws, clambering up the hillside and marching over the meadow to the scruffswood gate. Its leaves listened to the breeze and heard the screeches, barks, and yaps of Gibgob and her rabble of scruffs. It had felt the chopping axes and gnawing saws, cutting into the trees below. Suddenly, Grandrasil's rough bark began to move, scrunching its dents and bumps into an angry, furrowed face, which formed and grimaced as it felt the sharp blades slicing its fellow trees. It began to shake violently, sending shockwaves down the roots and quaking the ground around them, toppling the sprig onto its behind. The tremors travelled far down the hill and into the woods, where they shuddered and shook through the plants and trees, rattling the branches down to every single leaf. Tinkan Crud sat at the base of a large tree, hiding from the rest of the scruffs. He was counting the shiny scraps of stuff that he had swapped for the tools, which the scruffs now twanged, sprang, and clanged against the hard, rough bark. From behind the tree peeked Gibgob, who had sneaked up on the unsuspecting Tinkan. He flipped a shiny, golden rock into the air and waited for it to drop into his paw. After it failed to do so, his puzzled face looked up to see the clasping paw of Gibgob, which held the shiny lump between her long, sharp claws. Tinkan quickly grasped her paw, and the two began to tussle, each trying to snatch the rock from the other.
"Give it back! It's mine! It's mine!"
yelped Tinkan.
"I want it! I want it! Give it to me!"
yelled Gibgob, her eyes and beak clenched tightly closed in a fierce grimace. Suddenly they heard a loud creak, which came from the tree behind them. Still holding onto the shiny rock, both Tinkan and Gibgob turned their heads to see where the creak came from. The tree's bark scrunched together to form a face, cracking and crumpling into a scowl which frowned down upon the pair of squabbling scruffs. Two deep, dark eye-holes stared coldly at them. Long, twisted branches swept from above. Coiling and snaking, they weaved and knitted together into a cage, which closed fast and tight around the pair of scruffs.
"On second thoughts, it's clearly yours,"
claimed Tinkan, politely, as he let go of the rock. He promptly turned and wriggled through the closing cage and rolled away, down the hill towards the rest of the gang. Gibgob gazed upon the shiny stone. Its reflection twinkled in her beady eyes. She grasped it tightly in her paw, then stuffed it in her wig, hiding it on top of her bald head next to the lice and nits who celebrated their newfound wealth. She turned to run from the tree's woven grasp and tried to dive through a closing gap. Her round body, fattened by her greed, became stuck between the branches. Only her head fit through the gap. She took a deep breath, then began to shout,
"Help!"
The gang of scruffs couldn't hear her shouts. They were all too busy running and hiding from the many roaming trees which had uprooted themselves from the ground. They swept their branches round like great clubs and crawled around on their roots, which wriggled like tentacles beneath their trunks. The Scruffs scurried around, trying to escape from the grasping branches. One by one they were scooped up by the trees and tossed high into the air, out of the forest and towards the town, where they landed in the woolen rooftops or in the thick gloop of the stinking River Skug. Tin Can poked his head through a hole in the hairy thatch, into which he had performed a soft but thoroughly itchy landing. Across the rooftops he could see many Scruffs poking their heads from nooks, crannies, crevices, and coves. Some were still falling from the sky, like small, hairy shooting stars. Munch had flattened a whole hut where he fell, and Scrag had luckily fallen straight into his bathtub of bin juice. Suddenly they heard a loud cry coming from the sky, and looked up to investigate. Gibgob was falling towards the town. She had been flung higher than any other Scruff. Rattled her screech as she grew closer. She held on to her wig with one paw and flapped her other feverishly, like a fluttering wing, in a desperate attempt to fly. Tin Can watched in awe as she crossed the sky above him, then plunk! Into a huge chimney stack she crashed, tumbling and rolling around the inside wall, before hitting the pile of ash at the bottom with a soft, dull thud. From the great wonky stack blew a cloud of ash, pluming high into the sky above. Its shape resembled the bald, angry head of Gibgob. The old, wise Grandrasil was surrounded by many plants, bushes, and trees from the forest, which had skittered and scuttled up the hill on their roots, seeking safety. There were angry oaks and furious pines, enraged elms and grumpy willows, all shaking their branches and rustling their leaves. The sprig pushed its way between the gathered trees. It squeezed, then popped through the gap, rolling across the leaf carpet before coming to a stop, sat in front of Grandrasil. The ancient tree sat silent, its large, hollow eyes tightly closed, and its branches frozen still. Around it, the forest trees continued to sway and swoop, their rustling as loud as crashing waves. Suddenly, from below the ground, sprang the roots of Grandrasil and pulled the other trees down into the dirt. They stopped their furious shaking, and the woods fell eerily silent. Even the smallest shrews and twittering birds quietened as Grandrasil opened its hollow eyes. A bright green light started to glow from the holes. The ancient tree looked down upon the small, shrubbery sprig and whispered to it upon the breeze. Words of wind rustled through its leaves.